And she was one of the IEEE's 10 to watch in one of their more recent lists. So that's always fun. All right, take it away, Cynthia.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, they never say what to watch me for. So, take it with a grain of salt. So today I want to talk about how we can talk to robots, and which is actually very easy. All of us talk to robots, but I also want to talk about how robots can listen and make use of that language. And to start with, I want to motivate that a little bit. The core idea underlying a lot of this work is that robots in human spaces that are collaborating with people need to be able to communicate. It's very difficult to collaborate in any meaningful sense with an agent that you're not interacting with or having any kind of interaction or any kind of communication with. And for my purposes, I define successful interactions as ones in which the robot does what a human user wants it to do. So in human-robot interaction, or HRI, the goal is always to have these interactions that are intuitive and adaptable. And you want to be able to direct and customize both your environment and your teammates. You want to be able to tell people what to do. So language in the world that is natural language, not in vacuum, but as it refers to objects and things in the world around us, is called grounded language, from the symbol grounding problem. And the only warning I have for that is that grounded language has become a very popular thing to study lately, but natural language and vision and robotics all mean slightly different things by that terminology. In robotics, it means language that's grounded in percepts and actions. And for me, as Matt said, natural language learning and learning in general have always been a big part of my interest. How can we learn from language? How can we learn language? And the key to answering that question is that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. Symbols denote semantics. They're grounded out in something in the world. And symbols have to be connected to reference to have non-vacuous meaning. So grounded language acquisition just means learning language from those interactions. And historically, we've done a lot of, if we want a computer to know what the word apple means, we give it some sequence of formal definitions that we can hopefully do some inference over with respect to terms and things. But in practice, if you or any other human or agent wants to know what something like an apple is, you do something like this. You get an apple, you move it around in front of your sensors, you interact with it, you smell it. And that's how you learn the true meanings of words. Stephen Harnad, and I apologize for the wall of text here, I promise it's the only one, is a very famous person, philosopher in linguistics and many other fields, discussed the symbol grounding problem and defined it as follows. If cognition is the process of symbol manipulation, if the mind is a symbolic system, what is the meaning of those symbols? Where does that come from? Symbols can refer to other symbols, which he refers to as the meaningless symbol merry-go-round. But it's necessary to have some way of going bottom up, where the percepts, the inputs that you can perceive, are what underpin the symbols that you're manipulating. And in 1990, he proposed that a hybrid symbolic, non-symbolic approach was necessary for really addressing this symbols and cognition question. In a symbolic model, in a pure symbolic model, symbols don't have meaning. They interact only with one another. In a purely robotic model and a purely connectionist model, names are connected to objects through patterns, but you can't do reasoning over that. There's no composition, so there's no concept of inference and learning. That was 30 years ago. Now robots give that context. And this is a two-way street. Robotics needs natural language to make the human interaction good, but natural language needs robotics to provide that context. So just pop quiz. What is the person telling the robot to do here? And the answer, of course, is we have no idea. What about now? And here, the concept, the perceptual data that can be provided by the real world and by the robots is just provided by the world that's being perceived. All of this requires machine learning. Very little of this has gotten very far trying to predefine everything in the world. So if collaboration is control plus communication and language is a natural mechanism, then there's an argument to be made that what you really want is to presuppose what objects things need to interact with and what the symbols that connect to them are. And routinely, people say, why do you need to do learning for this? Why can't the robot be given information about the things that it will encounter in its world? And the answer is that I work on robotics, and I think a lot of us are interested in these broader cognitive settings, where instead of being in a factory where the robot just does the same thing, interacts with the same things over and over, I want agents that are operating in a human space, in human environments. And the space of objects in the world and the space of language that can refer to them is just too broad for us to predefine. All of these objects, by the way, are kitchen tools. And they're all fairly common kitchen tools, something that it wouldn't be unreasonable to randomly find on someone's counter. But none of them is something that I would consider pre-programming into a robot that I was going to put in someone's house. When I talk about symbol grounding, although that's a complex space, a lot of the time it can be treated as a problem of classification. When you're using symbols and you're saying this is a lemon, or go to the end of the hall and turn left, or these blocks are together, the reason you're providing that information is really because you want to be able to say, could you get me a lemon? Or which way did he go? Or which way do I go? Or help me perform a task. And these are classification tasks. These are tasks where you're classifying objects and actions. And once you start thinking of symbol grounding as a question of classifying spaces in the world, then you can start to discuss this problem formulation, where you consider training data to be sort of natural language utterances, like hand me the orange ball, and the observed world context, plus some kind of interaction that ties them together, that provides the pairing of the orange ball, hand me the orange ball, and this object. From there, you learn a natural language parser that generates the correct formal language that you can then use to apply to something like, identifying objects in the world. And then the percepts can get turned into memberships. This thing is an orange. And a lot of the early grounded language work worked in that space, and that's very cool. But ultimately, it still presupposes that the formal concept exists. It still presupposes that your representation has something, some meaning for orange or shapes. And it's a real challenge if what you want to do is learn about completely novel objects and attributes and actions using completely novel symbols. So learning novel concepts is entirely something that depends on interaction. And it's in the space of what's called open set classification, if you are willing to treat it as a classification problem, or open world recognition. And in this case here, we're talking about a robot that has never seen yellow things, or at least not that have been described as such, has never heard the word yellow. And here's somebody saying all of these blocks are yellow and pointing to them. And that could mean a lot of different things, given just one data point. So you form hypotheses. Maybe yellow is a color, maybe yellow is a shape, maybe yellow means clustered. And then the more data that you see in the world, the better you can disambiguate which of those is correct. A little more formally, you can then treat symbol grounding as a learning task, where the training data consists of language and objects, and the grounding is given. So the objects here are, when you say these blocks are red, it's given that this is the correct grounding, that that's what's being referred to. And then at test time, You supply the language in the objects. You say, okay, this is blue cube, get me the blue cube. And hopefully you have learned the symbol blue and the symbol cube, and you can turn those into the correct grounding in the space. So for attributes, we call this the object selection problem. And identifying blue cubes isn't necessarily in and of itself that exciting, but learning purely from language and pointing gestures what novel symbols in the world means is actually a really interesting starting point. And it's something that is, to the best of my knowledge, some of the first work on really solving the symbol grounding problem in a purely perceptual way. To get a little more formal, well, I promise I don't spend too much time on equations because I think that makes for a bad talk. But here, what we're trying to do is compute the probability of some indicated set, that some set being the set that we refer to. And we call that set G, the groundings, conditioned on the natural language sentence X and the perceived set of objects O. So we do this by summing over two latent structures. There's Z, which is the formal expression derived from X, and W, which is the probability of a world, the probability of different subdivisions of the world into objects. And this gives us a final joint model for selecting the named objects G. So that looks like this: the final grounding, which is what we're trying to compute, and the Z, which is the formal representation of meaning, and W, the subdivision of the world into things described by those concepts, is calculated from just, these are the ones that are blue, and somebody pointing to these things. And once you have treated this as a joint modeling problem in that way, a lot of different things can fit into that paradigm. A lot of different things can be treated as inputs that have to be jointly constrained by this estimation. So this works. These are somewhat older results now, but I think it's worth discussing them a little bit. On here we've got words that appeared in our data corpus down the y-axis. So these are words. None of this was created by programmers, was built in by us. And on the x-axis, we've just got a bunch of new classifiers. And those don't actually have human meaningful names, right? Because each classifier represents a hypothesis. Maybe this term cube means a new color. Maybe it means a new shape. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's a null token that isn't relevant to our perceptual data. And when you do that, a few things, and this is a table of the weights that connect new classifiers with new terms. And this is a many thousands by many millions table. There are thousands of new tokens in any data corpus of speech of even moderate size, and millions of hypotheses for what words can mean. But what you can see here from this selected set is we can learn what color words mean very quickly, which makes sense, right? That's a fairly easy classification problem. Shape words like cube or arch or triangle are more difficult because those objects look different from different perspectives. Shape is more complex generally. And in this right-hand column, we see that the words thing and that and toys, which have no particular meaning perceptually in the data set that we're working with, or in general, that and thing, the semantics for those do not ground out in the world. It has gradually become the case that this doesn't mean anything is the best explanation for the data that we've seen so far. They're null tokens. And you may have noticed that I am talking specifically about color and shape, and particularly color, shape, and object type. And that's actually fairly limited. So more recently, we've started talking about category-free learning. That is, how can we learn whatever tokens people choose to use on objects in the world and use those for more complex objects, leave blocks world, leave the color and shape space, and start talking about more complex language and objects. So this is from the well-known UW RGBD data set, well-known in robotics. And this is just a data set of objects from many, many different angles with associated depth data categorized into a rough ontology. We're working on our own data set now, which is a bit more complex and has some nice features. But right now, because this data set doesn't have language associated with it, we took it to Amazon Mechanical Turk and got several thousand descriptions of the objects in it that we could use for the purposes of learning what language means with respect to it. And because we're no longer working with known visual categories of attributes, we are now looking for general perceptual features. And it turns out one effective way to do this is just apply a CNN, standard deep learning to extract features broadly, and then remove the softmax function at the end, which would be used for the final solving of the classification problem. Remove that function to expose the features themselves and take those features and use them to perform classifier learning token by token. So use those features to learn what yellow means or what yogurt means or what lid means. And if you run that over this data set, which is about 300 objects and about 3,000 sentences, then you can start to develop classifiers for things that people use routinely that are not in any way defined by the people who made the visual part of the data set or by us. Words like aluminum and ceramic and cups start showing up. And then, the only language preprocessing we're really doing here is removing stop words. And you end up with results that are comparable to handcrafted features in their accuracy, but many, many more classifiers. You're not limiting yourself, you're not limiting yourself to only the tokens that are meaningful in very limited color and shape space, but you're also able to present more complex scenes and more complex objects, and as a result, get more complex language describing them. And these are all precision recall and F1 scores. And these, this work will appear in a few months in IROS. So these are the pre-final results. But you can see that these are for, being several hundred classifiers built over a small data set just from people describing things. This is pretty good accuracy. So the formalism I've described is model agnostic. I haven't talked much about how we're doing the actual learning once the joint model for an objective function has been defined, because it doesn't really matter. You can actually use logistic regression, you can use a wide variety of things. And it's applicable to a wide variety of modalities, any perceptual input that can be featureized. So it can be done from vision or depth or traces of people performing activities or navigating. This flexibility, this ability to apply it to, semi-arbitrary possible meanings for symbols is, that level of power generally comes in any kind of machine learning with being very data hungry, right? So if we've got this sort of context model and perceptual model and a language model that's being learned separately, and they're held in agreement by a grounding, and the grounding is this sort of thing in the center. Again, these terms are made human readable, but in practice, they're not human readable when they're learned, then it's going to get out of control relatively quickly. And the insight that we have that makes this a lot more manageable is that there is a connection between any given piece of language and the percepts or actions that that language is describing, right? That's the grounding. That's what we're trying to find. It's the semantics in the cognitive sense, the meaning. And if the goal is to learn a shared joint model of that embedding, if we can treat it as there's some shared embedding that is the semantics with projections into the language space and the perceptual space, then all we have to do is learn a complete mapping between semantics in the world using language and perception as lossy channels, which is to say we need to solve 90% of cognition. That's not really in and of itself feasible, not in a single piece. But broadly, once we know that the shared embedding is there, we can leverage its existence to improve our learning before we've actually performed any mapping. That is, because we know that the connection is there if unobservable, then we can use it without knowing what it is. And I think that's easier to understand with an example. Unsupervised methods of learning need negative examples. There's a small class of exceptions, positive unsupervised learning. It's a difficult space, but broadly speaking, negative examples make machine learning a lot, I want to say feasible, at least much more effective. And we can provide negative examples of symbols once we know what words mean. But if we don't know what the words mean yet, it's very difficult to come up with negative examples. And that's partly because people don't typically, don't unprompted, provide any negative information about an object. If you ask somebody to describe something, they're not likely to hold up a lemon and say, this isn't a carrot, not unless some error has prompted that. And the lack of positive labels does not imply a lack of negative label, does not imply a negative label, because language isn't exhaustive. So if I say this is a lemon, that doesn't mean it's an okay negative example for being yellow. And the way we address this is take the descriptions of the objects, and this is, knowing what objects they describe, but not understanding anything about the meaning of the terms in them. But take the whole sentence of descriptions, encode them in some semantic space using something called paragraph vectors. There's other ways to do it. And get a vector of each of the objects. And even though we don't have semantic groundings for them, at this point, all we can say is, here's an encoded vector of a sentence. We can take the cosine dissimilarity between those vectors. And we can get something like this. So again, we have no idea what any of these words means yet. These are just words that we know that people describe, sentences that we know people use to describe things. But if we encode the sentences that people use to describe this banana, labeled yellow banana for our convenience, and map it in a space with all of the words people use to describe all of these other objects, what we find is it gives us a pretty good, that distance metric gives us a pretty good concept of similarity. So then we can use the things down here, the things that are far away from it, as negative examples. And now from the data that we have, without understanding any of the symbols in the data yet, we have found the negative examples of language and object that we can use to train our banana classifier. Now we can learn what the symbols do mean. Doing this works far better than the two typical approaches for finding negative examples in grounded language, which are either just use everything as a negative that isn't denoted as a positive, or randomly choose negative samples from everything that isn't denoted as positive. And the thinking there is that most things aren't lemons. If you randomly choose things that aren't described as lemons to be negative examples, it should work pretty well. Most things aren't lemons, most things aren't yellow, etc. But if you can actually use this shared embedding to figure out how dissimilar objects are based purely on this featureization of the language, then you can get dramatically better results. So yes, hidden semantics connect language and perception. We knew that, that's what we're trying to find with the grounding, and we can use that. And we can use that as the meaningful part of this. And once we know that we can use that, we can start talking about finding those embeddings, finding that shared latent space more directly. And I'm going to talk about using geometric methods here rather than deep learning methods. I can get into why that is and sort of the reasoning there closer to the end. But the idea of manifold alignment is a technique in which you take data from different domains. In our case, that's different perceptual and descriptive modalities. and assume that they have a shared latent space. And then you can take concepts from different domains in the same space and try to find a projection from that latent manifold that does a good job of explaining the objects and language that you're seeing pairs of. So to do this, we use something called triplet loss. And the way you use triplet loss for manifold alignment is essentially you take similar concepts from different domains and force them to be together while forcing dissimilar objects apart. So here we need something called an anchor point, which is something in the perceptual domain. Our anchor point here is an apple with color and depth. We extract features from that. And then we've got a negative example of descriptions of that and a positive example of descriptions of that. And extract the features from those, do an alignment. And the goal here is to find some manifold where the positive features, the positive language features are associated with the anchor point, which is positive in a different modality, and the negative example, which is associated with some other object in our data set, is forced to be far away. And if you do that successfully, we've tried a lot of different methods here, and these two images on the left-hand side are the clusters that form, and each cluster can represent a classifier that's supposed to describe an object. And one of those clusters is in language and one of them is in vision. What you want is for those to be identical. You want them to overlap perfectly so that you can say this little block of terms in language means this little block of things that I'm seeing. And you can see this is pretty close. Using the triplet method as described for the data set that we have, data sets that we have, you can get pretty close to 100. You can get 98% accuracy on identifying objects, given the language describing them. There's another data problem, and this is a data problem that's significant in robotics particularly, but also generally in cognitive science, cognitive research, which is collecting data about different domains in different settings is hard. Keeping a robot working for 100 people or 200 people trials is a shockingly difficult problem. And collecting data in a bunch of settings, a home, a school, a hospital, and so on. You have to get the robot there, you have to get the people there, you have to get IRB permission to have a robot talking to people in a hospital, not my favorite task. And it's complicated data. We're collecting speech, images, depth. We're doing speech recognition on the images and trying to get something useful out of that. And all of that is independent of the fact that we can't actually get people near each other right now. And this is a problem for example, my robotics lab, but it's also a problem more broadly in that it makes this research, which is important, interesting stuff. Robotics is a growing field. It's the embodiment and embodied cognition. If you need to yell at me about that statement afterwards, I understand. It's attractive to underserved populations, groups that we are trying to see more of in computer science. Women and underrepresented minorities often find robotics particularly interesting or appealing, but it's really difficult to start a robotics research group. Roboticists are expensive, robots are expensive. The image of this robot on the slide manages to be both a fairly low-cost starter robot and slightly more than my first house. And what we would like to do is be able to do it with just a computer and some relatively inexpensive hardware. That would be better in a lot of ways. So we're approaching it, so I'm approaching all of this grounding stuff now, this is newer, as a simulation to reality problem. Simulation to reality is a growing keyword in artificial intelligence, where, and especially in robotics, where generally the idea is learn as much as you can from a high quality simulation and then bring it to the real world. And if we can do simulation to reality based learning of groundings of the meanings of words and concepts and interactions, then we can set that to be anywhere. We can set that to be in any setting. And we can have the robot learning from these simulated percepts. Most of the sim to real happening in human-robot interaction right now revolves around training the human and finding out how humans feel about robots, things like that. It's not about the robot learning from simulated human interactions, or rather real human interactions occurring in simulation. So this is the sequence of events in which we're doing this learning. You start by having these interactions occurring in virtual reality. So you've got a person interacting with a robot partner, giving them instructions on what to do. And we're collecting the participant's speech, gesture, head posture, which we use as a proxy for gaze, all the modalities that people use when they want to communicate. People don't just use speech. And the robot percepts are built from the simulator. So here's what the robot's camera should be seeing. Here's what the robot's depth imagery should be. And then once we've gotten that interaction down, we can add different sensors to the robot and replay it, or put different noise models in, or use a different rendering engine completely. None of that would change what the human would have done. And when the robot has learned things in that interaction setting, we can transfer it to the real world. And we can say, okay, here's, a similar but not identical setting, because it's never going to be identical. You want the robot to learn generalizable symbols in flexible settings and see, can this physical robot here perform the same tasks as this simulated robot based on what it has learned from those interactions? And how much additional real world learning do you need? To build this system, we're relying on a few pieces of equipment. This is a photogrammetry rig, which can be used to take high fidelity models of objects, people, platforms. Somebody goes inside it, and 128 cameras take pictures simultaneously. And then there's specialized software that maps that all together into a single meshed model of, for example, this grad student. And obviously the photogrammetry rig isn't generally available, but once the assets are made, they can be as available as any other, graphical model or image. We're also doing a lot of this in a participant, well, we were until about January, doing a lot of this in a participant interaction space that's essentially a cave. It's a curved wall of monitors where you can stand in the center and interact with the robot using these pointing devices and see the robot wandering around to do things. And that's useful for people who find headsets nauseating, but there's nothing going on here that can't happen in a relatively inexpensive, gaming-oriented virtual reality headset. So again, this is for development purposes. We've developed some scenarios suitable for testing, and because this is virtual, we can do experiment prototyping very quickly. We don't have to go through everything involved in getting a robot into a hospital and getting permission just to put a human in a hospital and see what happens, see if we're asking the right questions. This imagery to our left is the actual UMBC's actual main cafeteria. It's called True Grits. And this is a high resolution rendering of it with manipulable objects and things. It's the emptiest I've ever seen it, but other than that, it's very realistic. And the intent is to take the robot there and see if it can follow instructions for, go get me some kind of savory snack or something to that effect, whatever it successfully learned from interactions with people. And on the right, we're seeing what the robot sees. This is the robot's sensor data. It's incoming vision and depth data, simulated. So I think it's easier to understand this sort of seeing it in motion, or at least I think it's more interesting. So here you can see that we've got someone controlling the robot. It's moving around in a space, and the vision of what the robot is seeing is down here. You can see that it's changing and moving around. And the goal of these experiments is to have someone in these spaces saying, okay, roll up to that little cabinet. You're going to have to turn right to see it, and get me that pitcher full of water. Or ideally, I'm thirsty, right? Which is a much more interesting symbol grounding problem than get me that pitcher of water. Okay. So the points I'd like to make and make sure we can do takeaways from here is that the symbol grounding problem itself is one of the core problems of symbolic cognition, of a symbolism-based cognition model. And embodiment is a necessary piece for dealing with that, but it's also a complex one, a difficult, thorny piece with a lot of needs. You can joint models of language and perception, once they're good, once you're doing a good job of learning them, are semantics. Once you have a model of what symbols mean in the world, then you have the sort of viscerally deep semantics of what does something mean that people have that transcends pure definitions. But the accessibility and data that this kind of work depends on are critical. And I say accessibility because they're not universally available. We as a field, robotics especially, needs to be aware of that and focused on ways of reducing that difficulty. And finally, I'd like to say I have the extreme pleasure of working with some amazing collaborators and a bunch of amazing PhD students. So I say we because a bunch of my students who are great people are doing all of this work because they're wonderful. So we, because this is not entirely to my credit. And with that, thank you. I'll take any questions.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. That was a really interesting talk. We have a number of questions in the Slack channel. I will start asking them in the order that I see fit. So we'll start with Will Bridewell's question, which says that we often see examples of symbol grounding in object categories like blocks or qualities like blue. But what do we do about the general ground, the grounding quantifiers that you see like all or one that were in those descriptions as well? And then also, what are you going to do with the grounding symbols that were discussed in the previous sessions that involved all the questions of goals and actions and plans? And how do you, like, does this approach look at how you could ground those things as well?
Right. So that is two questions.
Of course.
For the first one, how do you deal with quantifiers essentially in the world? And quantifiers broadly, I mean, things like together are also a quantifier. That is actually something we're using a language formalism called combinatorial categorical grammars, CCGs, which have the expressive power to express quantification. So I've been talking about this sort of in terms of nouns and verbs, but in fact, the semantic parsing model that we're using under the covers is quite a bit more elaborate than that. And it can be used to interpret this is one of, for example. I haven't done a lot of work demonstrating that myself. One of my collaborators, Nicholas Fitzgerald, who's at Google now, has some ACL papers that are explicitly on that topic. So
right. Sounds good. Oh, you didn't answer the second
question,
yes.
Which is, how does this pertain to symbol grounding in a broader sense? And that's where grounding as classification runs into trouble, right? And the answer to that is my research group treats grounded tokens as inputs to a planner. This is work that started with Michael Lippmann and Stephanie Telex and Marie Desjardins on using these learned groundings. And we're learning symbols into a hierarchy that can then be used to support action generalization and goal representation. We're not directly grounding the goals. We are treating the groundings of things in the world as the planning language that goals and problem solving occur over.
Okay. had three questions I wanted to ask on that, but instead I'm gonna go with question number 4, which is from John Laird, and this is, seems like you assume some interaction, namely pointing, and this is sort of the labels that you're getting, but not others. And how would this problem change in the algorithms in particular if you really want to take this into more what you'd see with humans, which is that you would allow the robot to ask questions or allow the agent to ask questions?
Right. I'm delighted to have you ask that. I've got a branch of work. This young lady, Nisha Pillai, is working on a big data paper right now that's on active learning and interactive learning and how it overlaps with this. And a lot of what that boils down to is you can get much more focused data usefully if the people are asking questions and the robot is asking questions, if they're going back and forth, so that you're building a model of the robot's knowledge in a more informed, more efficient way. But that kind of active learning is, it's not a magic bullet. You can't just throw active learning at any sort of language learning, symbol grounding problem and have it actually improve the outcomes. And what we've found is that the complexity of what's being learned affects the choice of learning approaches. So if there are questions being asked, picking questions to ask and picking exemplars to give or to ask about depends a great deal on the kind of data and perceptual input that you're working with. So we're trying to work out kind of broadly, how do we make decisions about that kind of, about back and forth interactive learning, about how to do it well.
Okay, and similar, so Ray Kulhanek from Wright State Research Institute has another comment sort of on your unsupervised learning, or the way you're getting the negative examples part of your learning, which is, and I think it ties into some of the questions you brought in there about the complexity of the objects you're talking about. So won't your approach run into problems when comparing words with more or less orthogonal meanings by considering them to be negative examples when they're just not referring to the same properties? So you have these, as you bring more and more properties into the, the colors, the shapes, the types, savory, various hierarchy things that might be there. And so he would like you to speak a little bit more about that.
So it turns out negative examples don't have to, it's fine for negative examples to be orthogonal. It would be more accurate to say that what machine learning depends on is non-positive examples. So as long as your positive data and your non-positive data don't overlap, that negative example selection works pretty well. And I should specify that it works well outside the color and shape realm. It works well in the sort of general category free learning as well. If you're just, throwing complete sentences about whatever people feel like saying into a vector, you still end up getting a pretty good delineation where you can say these are examples of something that isn't what's being talked about. And you actually want a broad spread of things that aren't what's being talked about. That's what helps narrow in on what is being discussed. So there's really no irrelevant negative examples.
Okay, then I will, on that, so continuing this sort of object, just talking about the objects and their complexities, I'll ask one of my questions now, which is you used savory snack as the example in the later work there, and that sounds very similar to toys in the example from the first learning method. It's a hierarchy of classes that you have. But in the first one, you said that that's actually, that's a word that we don't know how to classify it. We don't want to build a classifier for it. And it's much more of a question of learning the class hierarchy. In the class hierarchy, my intuition is that you don't want to just have that drawn solely from visual features, especially when dealing with something like savory.
Perceptual features.
And so the question is like, are you going to use a more expressive language model, or what are your thoughts there?
Right, so that's a great question. That's probably not a great example for me to have used. Specifically, what I meant is from the area of our cafeteria, there's labeled savory snacks. but with a sign as such. But since you ask, we are looking at what's going to be involved. I mean, ultimately, obviously, you don't want to do this in a vacuum. You'd like to tie it into many of the existing ontologies and hierarchies. Can we connect our learned groundings to, for example, WordNet, and use that to further our understanding of, if somebody says, can you give me a savory? Can you get me something savory? Can we look at hypernyms for that and find one that's a symbol that we recognize and look around for an object that corresponds to that symbol? But something like savory, if you say this is pizza, it's a savory snack. This is a bag of chips, it's a savory snack. And if it comes up in the data set, then you will learn a savory classifier with those positive examples eventually, given enough data. But I think that's getting into the space where it starts making sense to try to connect to external hierarchies.
Or at least be able to interpret those things as perhaps learning that hierarchy as not a flat set of classifiers.
Yeah.
Speaking of a little bit more on this, you referenced sort of object complexity, and I'm not sure what you mean by that in terms of dimensions, but one of the things that comes up a lot when I look at this work and when I think about it is this notion of part wholeness. You had the flashlight, but people care a lot about the parts of the flashlight, especially for things like changing batteries. You had a classifier for arch, but that was just for a single block that is an arch from different perspectives, as opposed to constructions of an arch, which each individual object is not an arch itself, but the collection is one. So how do you deal with this sort of segmentation on the visual field about what is part of what you're talking about, or how does that correspond to the language?
Right. So when I say complexity, I'm talking about the literal visual perceptual complexity. So, a white screen isn't complicated. A Klimt painting is visually complicated. Everything else is somewhere in between. And what that paper is about is actually trying to formalize that and come up with some metrics that we can use to capture that sort of, am I seeing something complex? Yes or no? But for the core of your question, we don't handle compositionality in that sense. We're talking about learning about things in the world, and we're not right now trying to visually or otherwise subdivide objects. It's in robotics, segmentation of cluttered objects in a field of view is difficult. Like figuring out, if you look at these pictures, for example, figuring out that there's a person and a fence and another fence and a tree and another tree, and the fence is probably the same, but the trees are probably separate here, is an incredibly difficult problem already. So we're treating objects as essentially atomic. We're not getting into subdividing objects unless they can be physically subdivided.
Well, these could be physically subdivided. Well, are you saying that
does not normally get subdivided in the course of use. It does not normally get taken apart. So like a pitcher and its lid might, and in that case, we might learn different tokens for it. But it would be, because we're treating objects as sort of unitary in the world, learning about flashlight lens versus flashlight switch, we'd have to change, basically what we'd have to change is how we represent things in the world to some formalism where instead of there being a thing and another thing and them being separate and physically separable, to something where we had some perceptual concept of breaking physical objects down into differentiable parts. And we don't have that.
So in your approach right now, I guess I want to understand what you're assuming as input from the trained visual parts of the system. And is that just you you train a classifier, which then has a collection and specifies a collection of pixels that correspond to the classifier's concept.
Right, not a collection of pixels. So the
Bounding
visual
box.
pre-processing breaks down objects in the world into independent objects. And because we're not using just vision, we're using depth and thermal and things like that. That's an object in a 3D mesh sense, where you've got fused sensory information about multiple aspects of it that give you something that's a little more object-like than just a bounding box for things. But that object, that 3D, meshed out thing that the robot can pick up and move around in order to make a separate model of, that's the atom level.
So Sergey's asking another question here that actually it's more of a comment, and I'll try. Oh no, there's a question. One must be able to represent not just parts of events and objects, but also other properties of events and objects. So if you learn by classifying, clues are words that are themselves perhaps ambiguous. When the approach is applied at realistic size, won't this cause problems? I'm not sure if it's a question directly about polysemy, but other questions. Does this trigger thoughts in how you're thinking about it? And he'll feed back my interpretation of his question shortly.
I may have to read that question, but
so it's way beyond just that. All right, let's just take the idea.
I can talk about polysemy at least. Okay. When we're talking about polysemy, because what we do is we train a zillion classifiers. And we say, tell me which of the objects in the world matches that. Specifically, when somebody says something, the symbols in what the robot is supposed to do, in the language that it's receiving, those classifiers get run against all the objects that the robot can perceive, right? And you get sort of a table of, yes, this is referred to, no, this isn't referred to. And when you're talking about, for example, oranges in our data set, if somebody says, hand me an orange, and there's an orange on the counter sitting next to, I don't know, a bright orange can of Fanta, then it may very well get the wrong thing. Although this comes back to, I think, the question about quantifiers, hand me an orange, is linguistically a little different, and it may be different in a way that can be learned. In practice, what we find is that level of polysemy is usually this is the kind of thing that gets me in trouble with people, but in general, it doesn't come up a lot. Polysemous terms tend to occur either in relatively abstract discussion, where the grounding is happening at a different level, or in context switches. If orange is actually a pretty good exception, because there aren't a lot of things where there's a setting that has both an orange and orange things. You don't see a lot of settings where you've got a king running down the street in the pouring rain, right? Rain is not usually ambiguous in a particular context. So since what you're trying to do is identify objects that match symbols in a specific context, other possible meanings that don't occur in that context are not ambiguous. That's how that subdividing the world by type.
So, I mean, this subdividing the world by type, though, this is, like, you talk a bit about, okay, there's robots that are on assembly lines, and we probably can program huge amounts of them. We don't need learning as much.
Sure.
Or we need learning, but we can be very focused on how we're applying it. Then you obviously have a much broader vision, which is we can do this in much broader settings, and we want to be able to train incrementally. We want to be able to deal with what you didn't say, you want to be able to train to be able to operate in something like a more natural environment. And so I feel like you can't get away from them saying, oh, but natural environments aren't that polysemous, because I agree that there's something in between.
Because they're not. What I want is a robot that can function in any environment. And that is different from a robot that can function in every environment. Right? So one of the things that makes it difficult to pre-program robots with language is that say, for example, a care facility or a household have ecollects of their own, right? They have to be learned on a case-by-case basis. And part of why ecollects evolve is specifically to avoid ambiguity in a context. And it's not necessarily the case that I want a robot that I would put down in your house, get very familiar with your ecollect, get very familiar with your setting, and then pick up and put in my house and have it immediately start working without some retraining.
So in that sort of question, then what's the, I agree with the idea of bring it to my house. I have a whole bunch of words that I use to refer to all kinds of things that probably don't even match classifiers, or if you looked at them in other houses, they wouldn't make any sense. And a lot of times you'll have multiple words that would mean for the same sort of area, but how much, do you have a bounding on what you think that customization process would take, or what's the extent to which, like the amount of examples that it's going to need as it's led around the environment to sort of help understand what the language is, knowing that if you ask me what's the special words I use for my house, I wouldn't know. I would generate you some list of things, but there's going to be a whole bunch of things I'm like, oh wait, that's a special word, like, you know, 3 months later.
And you would learn it by having the robot in your house for those 3 months, and eventually it would get used. And that would be the point at which the learning occurs, right? It's intended to be an ongoing process. But ultimately, the reason I keep saying, well, the world isn't actually that ambiguous in any given context, and this is one of the great joys of being in robotics, is when I say it doesn't come up much, what I mean is it hasn't come up much, right? And if we get to the point where that starts being a consistent problem with understanding and with the robot's actions, that's the point at which I start worrying about it. That's my bound, is when I actually see it occur.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia. We're gonna move on now to the poster